Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Af Malhotra on Straight Talk with Af. Now, once again, I have, as I said, the habit of not disappointing you. In fact, pleasing you. Some people say, hey, take a positive spin on it. Pleasing you and delighting you. Today, I have a fantastic author who's written a number of very important books. And the most recent book that he's authored on the 20th of Feb, and one of the things I'm going to ask this author in a second, is all of his books have been released in Feb. Don't know why, whether his birthday's in Feb or it's just coincidental, but my research tells me all of them have been released in February in different years, 2019, 2017, 19, and then 2023. So maybe there's that's an auspicious month for our guest today. He has authored this book that has captured my attention because, of course, it's about the issue we've been discussing on Straight Talk for many, many years now, actually, relating to being human and making sure that we don't sort of lose sight of what it means to be human, the mojo and the oomph, the X factor that comes from doing this sort of stuff, sharing a glass of wine, having a meal together, meeting each other face to face, albeit that we are on Zoom right now. These are very important aspects of human development, human evolution. Disagreements is a part of human evolution. And all of these factors make us who we are. But at the same time, we have this dark side of technology that we also aware of, which is, dominating our minds, especially the younger generations who are without question addicted to social media in a way that is unprecedented and actually quite worrying for many of us. And I'm a parent, and I can put up my hand and say, that does concern me, although I am a technologist. So Dr. Tomasz Chamorro-Premuzic, welcome to Straight Talk with Af. What a pleasure to have you on the show today.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me up.
It's going to be an amazing conversation because your book, I, Human, with the subtitle AI, Automation, and the quest to reclaim our humanity, You couldn't have done a better job of creating that sort of a title. Before we go into the book, because there's so much to talk about, I'd like to know about Tomasz. Who is this person? Who are you? Where are you from? Tell us about your personal story a little bit, because that is how Straight Talk works. And then we connect that to why you are doing what you're doing today, if that's okay.
Of course. And listen, I don't know if I can match or live up to the expectations that you set up with that very kind introduction. But I will say, to disappoint our listeners from the very beginning, that I have no idea why the books are published in February. I wasn't even aware of this algorithm. It's something that the publishers decide. They must know. Maybe, they're not big enough for the Christmas release, so they come right after that. I'm sure, they have different windows in mind, but,
Yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out. I'll do a little bit of digging. So a little bit about myself. So I'm born and bred or raised in Buenos Aires, Argentina. That's still my, the place I called home, even though I've not lived there for over 20 years. I'm 47. I grew up in a middle-class family. My parents were academics. I was never really interested in studying. Actually, I first tried to become a tango dancer, then a football or soccer player for our American kind of listeners.
Wow.
Failed at both. And then, pretty much the third cliched profession that you can do if you are an Argentine, and the most popular if you want to study something, is I started to go into psychology. Buenos Aires, especially the area where I grew up, is called Villa Freud or Villa Freud. It boasts the highest concentration of psychoanalysts per capita in the world. So, it was very natural for me, having lived in an environment where a lot of people went to see a shrink or had a shrink coming to their homes, to be interested in the human condition and in, things like personality disorder, etc. I started my career in that area. I became a clinical psychologist, and I had patients, narcissistic, schizophrenic, paranoid, psychopathic patients. It was very depressing working in a public hospital in which I didn't have access to great medications. So they were either overly medicated and therapy couldn't do anything, or they were under-medicated and therapy couldn't do anything either. And mostly because of the deteriorating conditions, political and economic conditions of my country, when I got to the age of 24, 25, I was determined to leave, which I managed to do, getting a scholarship that got me into London first. And then, for the past 20 plus years, I've been sort of oscillating between the UK, mainland Europe, and the US. And what I do is connected to what you do, Af. I'm also kind of a technology entrepreneur. I'm very interested in talent technologies. So any tools like AI that help us understand human potential better. That's how I got interested in AI, and kind of the intersection between psychology and technology, or human and artificial intelligence. And my day job today is I run innovation for a big recruitment firm called Manpower Group. It's a big human capital firm, and we do all sorts of talent solutions. And I still teach, albeit very part-time, at the UCL and Columbia. And in the free time, I write books to try to kind of, spread the word and the gospel on the issues that I'm interested in.
Wow. Okay. So, and you said you don't have an impressive past. That's super impressive. I want to ask you a question. And Straight Talk is about, it's an unscripted conversation, as you know. It's like I was in a bar with you or having a coffee or a glass of wine with you. Okay. So I'm going to ask you questions that I think are unusual. I believe are unusual and aren't typical of a podcast, if that's okay. So the first thing I want to ask you is a little bit about your background, because you talked about this per capita. I didn't know that, by the way, the per capita ratio of the number of psychoanalysts. First question to you is did you ever work out why that's the case?
Well, I mean, it's obviously because we have a lot of issues, or at least we perceive that we have a lot of issues. I mean, that's the kind of fun, short, and obvious answer. But actually, there is an interesting socio-economic reason, which is that, up until about the late 19th century, so like 1890 or so, Argentina, and especially Buenos Aires, was one of the richest places in the world. It was really the equivalent back then and until sort of, I would say, the beginning of World War II, the equivalent of a Dubai or Singapore or Miami today, where a lot of people from the older world, from Europe and kind of industrialized or kind of historically richer economies, went to make money. And things were good. We had a booming agricultural sector. We have and still have a very educated kind of middle class. And at some point, Buenos Aires was so wealthy that it imported the traditions of upper class Viennese society, and then New York society, amongst which you can count, going to a shrink, a psychotherapist, specifically psychoanalysis was very big, still is very big. It was almost like today you would go to, your Pilates class or meditation classes, etc. Back then, I mean, if you were anybody, you would see your psychoanalyst 2 or 3 times a week, even if you didn't have any real problems. And actually, if you didn't, then it probably makes sense. If you actually had some serious conditions, as the science has shown for many decades now, that won't solve your issues. So, that kind of aspirational European and, French, Austrian, North American kind of attitude brought psychoanalysis there. And it had a very affluent class that actually, gravitated towards it. Now, I would say dispositionally, from a personality standpoint, we are quite neurotic. We are quite negative. We have things like tango and we have this very French existential attitude, very, very different from what you have in Britain, with very pragmatic and sort of like, very empirical Anglo-Saxon way of thinking about things. Here it's much more existential. It's much more romantic. It's almost metaphysical. And that means that everybody's thinking very hard about their problems, even when they actually don't have more than first world problems.
How interesting. I find the cultural element to be so important in the makeup of you as the person, you or me or anyone, the one, because no matter what age you look at, you have to cycle back and go connect the dots as to the cultural dynamics, how all those variables that we now know of, which, by the way, is totally offshoot, is the argument against meritocracy versus DEI, where people say, oh my God, stop, because I'm a big proponent of DEI, of course. And people say that's nonsense. It should be meritocratic. And then I talk about, well, hang on a second. Meritocracy is not fair because it depends on where you start from. And culture has a lot to do with it. And of course, I wasn't aware Buenos Aires was like a Dubai. just after post World War II. And of course, it's had a different path since then. And so that's important. So tell me a bit about, you've written a couple of really insightful books. I haven't read them all, but I will. You wrote one in 2017 about the talent delusion. And then you wrote one, which of course, so many people must have quoted, because it's all about the title is why do so many incompetent men become leaders? Now that's like, you're stirring the pot in 2023 beautifully. If you wrote that now, that book would be like number one on the charts, because of the whole gender movement, which has taken shape quite nicely. And then of course you wrote this book called I, Human, about AI. So tell me a little bit about, is there a connection between these three books that now you can make, looking backwards, historically, connect the dots? Obviously, you can't tell what happened then, but do you feel there's a connection between these three?
Yeah, I think there absolutely is, or at least, it's easy for me to connect the dots, at least looking back. And in fact, not that I want to advertise or promote a fourth book, but it really with me starts with the first trade book or popular book that I wrote, which was published in 2012, called Confidence.
Okay.
The surprising truth about how much you really needed, which has a very interesting story because, after being a full-time academic and already a full-time professor for about 10, 12 years, a book agent got in touch and said, oh, your research seems to be of more popular, wider interest. You want to do a book? And in a very kind of Argentine, overconfident way, I said, yeah, of course, sure, let's do it. I have a publisher that wants to commission a book on confidence. So, of course, yeah. I'll do it. It was a very, very difficult process to completely retrain myself to write for a popular audience. And actually, I still had that kind of approach that I had to really, in my mind, be an expert in an area before I can write even for a popular audience. So to cut the long story short, when I delivered the manuscript to a big American publisher, it was Penguin. It is Penguin. It wasn't the book they were expecting. They were expecting a book that basically was a typical self-help book, thinking, oh, believe in yourself, you think you're great, you are, whatever. And this was basically the closest you could get to a heretic anti-confidence manifesto that critiqued, this mindless and not very intellectual tendency to worship people who worship themselves and just tell people that the only thing that matter is whether they believe they're great, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, it was a very kind of a difficult process to negotiate between the original manuscript and what the publisher wanted. The book came out, not many people read it. It was a very interesting learning experience for me, but that to me started kind of this trend first to really try to identify gaps between sort of like urban legends or popular myths and things that we take for granted and the evidence that we have from either my research or existing academic research. If you think about the extension of, this idea that confidence is not good when it's very high, but it's good when it's aligned with your actual competence, and that what we should try to promote is really accurate levels of self-awareness as opposed to very high exacerbated levels of self-belief. Applying that to sort of like our current HR issues and problems, that's what the talent delusion is. It's the book that, I thought not just HR professionals, but leaders in general should read if they want to understand talent and create a talent-centric organization. And it's called, it was going to be called, Rethinking Talent, or, I don't know, Understanding Human Potential, something boring. My editor at the time, who was a very cynical, more sarcastic person than myself, very smart Finnish woman, said, look, all the time you're talking about delusions. We should call it the talent delusion, which I think is a good title. The subtitle is Why Data and Not Intuition is Key to Unlocking Human Potential. That's basically the theme. Even when you get to the book on why so many incompetent men become leaders and how to fix it, the how to fix it part is let's be more data-centric. Let's focus not on gender and focus on talent, because if you actually create the conditions for meritocracy to exist, you get diversity, and you can then start to worry about getting inclusion, which I know is at the center of what you preach and what you do with your own kind of activities and efforts to kind of promote diversity economics or help people understand the ROI or business case for diversity. And now maybe if we get to the last one, it's a slight departure. I was actually interested in doing a more philosophical book on what it means to be human in this age in which so many of our interactions and activities are dependent on machines, technology, computer. Just like you started the podcast during, the dark periods of the pandemic, I started to write this book during the dark period of the pandemic. So I didn't do a podcast or video cast, but I started to think, and of course, I was detached from in contact person or real physical interactions with others, except, my wife and my kids. And I became very aware of the influence that AI and technology is having on us and of the dehumanizing potential that living in the AI age have. And basically what I said to publishers is like, look, I cannot write a book on what it means to be human today at work or in life in general without going a little bit deeper into AI. So I wanted to do a book that is a book on AI that actually focuses on what I thought is the neglected aspect of the AI age, which is humans. It was finished in October 2022. The original book had a chapter on generative AI. The publisher said, what is this? Nobody cares about that. It came out, a week after OpenAI launched ChatGPT. And because of that, it's getting a lot of interest because actually, even though it's not a book on generative AI, it's a book on how we need to rethink human expertise, human skills, human talent, and humanity as a whole in this age in which we can, for the first time, outsource even our thinking and creativity to computers. So, the underlying or common thread is always the interest in human psychology and humanity, but I tackle it from different aspects. The first is more as a self-help book. The second is an HR book. The third is a diversity manifesto. And now we get to who we are in this age of smart machines and how, we need to try not to become robots or machines ourselves. If we want to preserve some of the aspects that actually make us relatively interesting, at least according to us.
Yeah. Brilliant. That's a beautiful summary. Thank you. And the connections now make a lot of sense. I love the way you describe your first book and on confidence and how you wrote something totally different to what your publisher would have wanted you to write. And that's a very interesting observation because I've interviewed about 110 authors now on this show and learned so much from all of you because each one of you has their own experiences. And like the journey of entrepreneurship, like the journey of life, there are many failures that of course never get talked about, or hardships or minefields or barriers or hurdles, whatever word you want to use. And those are more interesting. I think those are more interesting because let's be honest, what is being human? Being human is not trying to achieve whatever we think perfection is, or this sort of narcissistic existence that we are all sort of wrapped around or enveloped in because of the social media that we see around us. It is about all of those fallacies and flaws. That is what makes it super interesting, is that shit, I got it wrong. Oh my God, I wrote this book. I don't know what I was writing, but I wanted to write it, but no one wanted to read it. And as a musician, and I expect that you're a musician too, because I am as well. I see a clavinova, or that's what we used to call it in those days, and then a real piano on the right. So are you a musician? Yeah, you play the piano, I guess.
Yeah, I say, I can play to high enough standards that I can enjoy myself and I can listen to it. And if the people listen to me are close friends or relatives, they might be, polite enough to pretend that it's good, but that's where my skills finish. I love the fact that you use the term clavinova. Yeah, I call it an electric keyboard. This one, I think it's Yamaha, or what is it? Maybe it's a Roland. That one the kids love. I prefer to play that one. But you talk about, I think, the human experience. I think part of what's inherently human is to try to answer this question, even though we know that it's very difficult to answer it with any degree of certainty, objectivity, but also the inability to stop asking that question is also human. And, I'm interested in how culture and the specific kind of periods of human evolution refocus our answers, right? If you think about, for maybe 2000 years, we looked at God and religion for an answer to that question. Then, with the rise of the Enlightenment and Darwin and evolutionary kind of biology, etc., we were very territorial, reassuring ourselves and others that, we're better or we're unique compared to other animals, even if we descend from them. And I think now, we increasingly look at what machines can't do to conclude what makes us human. And, I find it quite interesting that a lot of critics of AI repeatedly point out that, there's a bunch of psychological traits or soft skills like empathy, emotional intelligence, and, self-awareness, curiosity, maybe deep curiosity, that artificial intelligence cannot emulate or cannot display. I always say, well, there's not much evidence that the majority of humans display any of these traits on a regular basis,
Right.
Even though we can, could, and should. So I think, it's very interesting to kind of see how we rethink ourselves if this truly is a very different era in our evolution. And that's basically what I tried to address with the book. Yeah,
you're bang on. I want to take you to, and I think being a musician is very important because it's the creativity is spurred on or is harnessed when you have arts, music, or any other form of creative talent or skills that you've built over time, is also a huge part of the discussion right now, which is where I want to go, which is about, yes, in November last year, generative AI went mainstream with ChatGPT, and the rest is history. And even to this date, there are many of us who have, who are on the hype curve. Some of us don't even know this thing exists, but they've probably read an article in the local newspaper or in the Times or in the FT or something. And I wanted to get your opinion on, I want to go into the dark side first, if that's okay. I'm sure we'll have the good stories and the positive bright side. On the dark side, there is a inherent fear amongst, let's call it the pyramid, just for the sake of it. There are many of us at the top of the pyramid, not because we're more important, it's just because we climb there really fast because we're into tech, and a small group of us who understand the implications of Gen AI, the good and the bad. And we practice it, we use it, we prompt, we're like mini prompt engineers, right? We understand large language models. I mean, I'm not a technologist, but I'm a business tech entrepreneur like you as well. And I'm using LLMs right now. I'm building LLMs with my Diversity Economics Institute. I get it. I see its good side. I see it where it's not working that well. I see where it requires a lot of money and work and so on. And that's all fine. But there are many in the pyramid at the bottom and in the middle who don't really know what this is about. And actually, there's a deep sense of fear and concern kicking in. Let's be honest, amongst many people all over the world, even in markets like, forget the West, even India, even in markets like India that is thriving on outsourcing and offshoring and pretty much running innovation centers, large, massive innovation centers, as you know, for just about every listed company on the planet. Even there is a sense of concern around, well, if repetitive tasks, which is what we do at a much cheaper cost, is now going to be replaced by this generative AI kind of software revolution, then what do we do next? Believe it or not, they also have a concern, right? So there's this conversation about jobs being lost. It's come up again and again. Thousands of companies have done studies. We're trying to now analyze all of the studies and synthesize all of the data to figure out, if McKinsey says 40% and BCG says 30, and then someone else says 20, what are we actually dealing with here? That's another exercise. But tell me a little bit about, it's a pointed question. I want to give you a scenario, okay? About 2 or 3 weeks ago, I watched 2 CEOs who you'll know of, or you might even know them. 2 very important CEOs. One is a chap called Bill McDermott, who is the CEO of ServiceNow. And then the other CEO is Jensen Huang, who's become super popular because of NVIDIA's, pretty much meteoric rise out of nowhere because of the AI, Gen AI story. Now, both these guys were sitting on some CNBC or some news channel together, talking about how they're in partnership together. And the future, it's a structural change. It is seismic. It is disruptive, like the mobile phone was many years ago, or the smartphone. Okay. And the question came up, yeah, this is all great, but what about the workforce? And they said, of course, the workforce, we have to retrain them. We have to reskill them. And it went on. Right. Now, I'd like us to challenge that a little bit. And I need to understand from you, in simple terms, for our audience, if I was someone who was watching this episode and I am terrified, okay, I'm terrified because I don't know what the hell this thing is. I've got a subscription. I don't really know how it can impact my life or my job, but I'm worried. Tell me first what you think Gen AI is, number one. Number two, what is the truth behind this job loss, retraining, eventually the jobs will come back? Let's cut through all of that. What's your view on that? So two questions.
Yeah, so I think, to define generative AI, not for what it is in a technically correct or academically accurate way, but more in terms of the almost like, functional or pragmatic implications that it has for most people, I think they can really think of it as the evolution of a chatbot. And you mentioned there's a lot of offshore customer service, IT, etc., jobs that have existed in India, Argentina, and many other places for a couple of decades. And most people will have interacted with chatbots through websites when they have a complaint or they need to book travel, etc. Up until this year, really, most of them were really bad, not very good, etc. So think about an evolution of that is 10x or 100x, to the point that now everybody can have a personal virtual assistant in their phone or in the screens that can actually carry out a lot of the tasks, problem solving, and even creative tasks that they need to encounter. So basically, you can use this to communicate with others. It can draft or create emails. It can create work reports. It can basically synthesize or analyze information. I think it's like where chatbots meet Google search and Wikipedia. Yes. And what's really impressive about this is that they have a real conversational feel or sense to it, whereby, it feels like you're talking to a human assistant that, let's face it, if it can do a lot of the things that real human assistants do, then it will be disruptive to a lot of jobs in the job market. I mean, I'm usually not an optimist in general and on these issues, but I do think, getting to the second question that you asked, that there are reasons to be rationally optimistic about what might actually happen. First of all, whether it's McKinsey, BCG, or other reports, we have to understand that in the recent past, we have been extreme in these predictions. Most famously, the book published by Oxford Said scholars, or I think it's the Internet and Cyber kind of Technology Studies Institute at Oxford, called Big Data in 2013, predicted that today a lot of the jobs that exist wouldn't exist anymore. The Economist and others have written about how off these predictions were. Moral of the story is, if you're going to make predictions into the future, for which nobody has data on, make sure that you predict at least 50 or 100 years into the future, so everybody is dead and they can't hold you accountable. Otherwise, it's safer to talk about the present or the past. Yeah. And if we look at that, I do think that the comparison of like smartphone or other areas or instances in the digital revolution is more relevant. Look, talent markets continue to intensify and continue to be very tight. More or less everywhere, unemployment rates are at a historical low rate. More or less everywhere, there's many more new jobs that are created because of technology than people willing to do those jobs, sometimes because of the skill shortage, sometimes because they're not interested, sometimes because of depressed wages, etc. But really, if you look at places like the US or the UK, the number of job vacancies continues to increase, and the number of job applicants really stays either the same or goes down. Right. So humans are needed, and humans will be in the loop. So, technology will do what it always did, which is it will destroy some jobs, create many new jobs in turn, people are talking about how prompt engineers are now more important than machine learning scientists or engineers. Soon, prompt engineers will not be needed because AI will learn to prompt itself, but there will be something else that comes.
Right.
And so I think the big disruption will come in the sense that existing jobs will completely change in the skills constellation they require, and whether you're a lawyer, physicist, a teacher, a marketer, a salesperson, or a customer service officer, how you do your job and the value that you bring to that job will change and has probably changed already as a function of what AI can do. So it's a little bit like, the Uber app didn't eliminate human taxi drivers, but it completely eliminates the need for taxi drivers to understand how to go from A to B in a city, and makes it far more important that they have a cool playlist, a nice conversation, and that the cars are clean and that they actually drive well. If you think about London, there's famous studies done where the original black cab drivers, or the traditional taxi drivers in London, their hippocampus, the area of the brain that is engaged in memorizing stuff, is bigger than controls, because famously, to pass the exam for a taxi driver, they needed to know every single historical address or site by heart without even looking at a map.
Correct.
There's still black cab drivers, but they all look at maps today. And what's important is that, they provide a good service. And I think that metaphor can be applied to every job. So look, I think there's no need to be terrified. And when I see the cover of Time magazine saying the end of humanity, I mean, it's quite frankly, not serious and a little bit apocalyptic and unnecessary, although it might sell. But I do worry more for people who don't worry at all, because they think it's business as usual, they're experienced enough, and they don't have to pay attention to this. I think a healthy degree of concern, and maybe, worrying too much is better than worrying too little. But what we should be doing, whatever you are doing and whoever you are, is experimenting, trying things out, and looking at how this thing can add value. Because fundamentally, if there's lots of things that are predictable, standardized, and automatable, they should be automatable. I love the autocomplete function of my emails, and I use it 50% of my time, because let's face it, most of the time, what I have to tell people that I email is very predictable and very boring. And I don't want to think how to be creative on those emails. I want to save time in order to do creative stuff somewhere else. And if there was AI that can actually email for me altogether, and you answer with your AI, and that basically frees up 30 or 40% of our time, that's great. So long as we don't waste it on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube, and we actually reinvest it on something that is fulfilling and more useful for our careers and our lives.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it, actually, because I think what you're saying, the examples you've given, I mean, Uber is a good example, and so the black taxi driver is a great example. I actually remember the time when Uber was about to launch. If you remember, there was this huge sort of battle against the traditional way of doing things, which is the black taxi drivers. Let's not forget that was their livelihood. They spent years actually training for that. It was a very, very hard exam. It's like a Navy SEAL exam, right? It's just, you don't have to run around. You have to use this and fire the hippocampus. And they were really distraught when Uber came in. They were like, how dare you use just a satellite navigation system, and so on and so forth. But now, if you go into a black cab in London, and I know you come regularly, you will see the cabbie has a sat nav. The cabbie actually relies on a sat nav because they believe it's more efficient, a better use of their time. And, maybe they're stressed from the day, maybe they're exhausted. Why do they need to remember the streets when a machine can help them do that? There's another dimension to this, which I find interesting. I spent some time at Harvard as well, and I was at one of the alum events recently, and a whole bunch of academics were discussing this with a few startup people. Always like startup founders because they're very pragmatic, as you know, and they talk about the real stuff, like you roll up your sleeves and it's like, shit, it doesn't work. That's the reality, because I'm trying the LLM, it doesn't work, or it does work, and it's more sort of pragmatic. And there was a debate going on about, this is the good side, by the way, about how generative AI can actually make us more intelligent. All of us. How generative AI, if you ask ChatGPT right now, what is the fallacy of meritocracy? And give me data accurate data, give me case studies, and give me the names of authors who've written books to support this point. It will, inside 10 seconds, answer that question for you, right? Now, think of the power of that. In fact, this is a live example. I used it I was in a briefing the other day, and we're talking about something to do with DEI and meritocracy. I thought, let me see what ChatGPT has to say. And it built a very coherent argument with sources. And I thought to myself, okay, now how have I become dumber, or have I become, has my mind become richer because of this? And I figured out that my mind's become richer because I'm playing this back to you now, but I read through it 2 or 3 times and I started to critique it. I thought, is that fair? I'm not sure if that's fair. Actually, that's a good point. Is that fair? I'm not sure. And so I was analyzing. In fact, I could have gone into a debate if I wanted to with ChatGPT to get my thinking clear. Whereas previously I would have had to think myself and be this intellectual who's read 50 books and 1,000 books and interviewed 110 people. Now I can engage in the debate with the AI and become smarter. What's your view? Because you're an academic, you're a business leader, you're a tech entrepreneur, you've got so many hats. Tell me what you think about that.
So first, I think that if, Voltaire, Diderot, and the sort of like, pioneers and founders of the Enlightenment, who were the encyclopedias of the time, and they actually went through a manual process of compiling all the knowledge that was available. Imagine if they had ChatGPT, right? I mean, they wouldn't even believe it, and they would probably spend all day on it. It's fantastic that this tool has gone from having 0 to 100 million users faster than TikTok and Instagram, because it is quite geeky, whereas you say Instagram, very narcissistic, TikTok, it's like digital crack cocaine, Alice Fitness, so I think that gives me hope that actually people are quite curious. Partly they want to use it in a pragmatic sense to make their job more interesting, or actually work smart and do more with less, which is what productivity is about and what technology is about. But partly I think they are curious. As a psychologist, I spend a lot of time using it because it's a great way to crowdsource what most people think about a subject, even with the guardrails that it has, right? And when people point out that, okay, you ask it to crack jokes on Biden and it only gives you 10. But if you ask it to crack jokes on Trump, it gives you 20. Therefore, it has a liberal bias. I think it's quite interesting that the developers have gone to great lengths to insert the guardrails to actually make it more objective than most humans are. We love our biases so much that we actually dislike it for being so politically incorrect. It's a little bit like the BBC, that people on the left accuse it of being right and people on the right accuse it of being woke. So it might be the highest possible degree of objectivity that something can have, which is to make everybody equally unhappy. On expertise, I think, look, it's a little bit Wikipedia-esque in that if you don't know anything about the subject, you can go from 0 knowledge to 70% very quickly, and that's great. In fact, Wikipedia might be better because you actually have sources and it's vetted by experts, and it's a very altruistic exercise by humans trying to make humans smarter. Here, of course, generative AI can hallucinate or bullshit, which actually we are threatened by because we thought bullshitting is an inherently human quality, and now we have AI.
That's brilliant, yeah.
But so I think that it's a little bit like any other area. Like if you have expertise in an area, let's say, if you know about wine, music, movies, travel, or I don't know, medieval history, you're probably not going to use this or any other tool that is out there to tell you what most people like or dislike or think about something.
Yeah.
But actually, it's quite useful to use it so that you know better, right? So if I know about wine, I don't look at Vivino and I don't take a picture of the labels to say, okay, I should buy this one, because I know. Yeah. And actually, increasingly, generative AI should be used for us to assess whether we know. And then remember, you still have to demonstrate to other people that you know more than the tool that is out there. So basically, I think the analogy that I would use is that this is a little bit like the intellectual equivalent to the fast food industry. It's a very quick, cheap, at scale, maybe tasty and quite addictive way to to nourish our hungry mind, but it's not very nutritious. I know you're interested in well-being, so we might talk about this as well. But hopefully it won't kill farm to table or slow food or gastro, pubs. It would hopefully let us value the craftsmanship and the element of deep curiosity and critical thinking that you were describing. That it's like, I love it, I play with it, but actually I go deeper. So I think we need both. Sometimes you want burger and fries and soft drinks, and that's okay. But if you only do that, you're probably not going to advance your intellect, particularly because that's the stuff that everybody can access. And especially if you want to be creative, like imagine if you wanted to start your next venture, you cannot seriously go to ChatGPT and say, tell me how I can make 100 million pounds or dollars in my net worth and actually do it. Because every other person can do that. But it's probably useful for you to ask that question to know how you can deviate from the stuff that everybody else is thinking about. And look, the same goes for, so I think there is that very democratic and meritocratic element that this could have in terms of lowering the barriers to entry and being an equalizer, so long as you have curiosity and so long as you have the time and the skills to invest in going beyond that and adding the human value that machines will never be able to add. I'll give you a final example that I think is very important and gets us back to music. Spotify probably has enough data on its artists and musical preferences, etc., to actually automate all of the artists that are there. And we already saw AI improvising like Miles Davis or completing Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, and experts not realizing that it was AI, right? Spotify could actually use AI to automate all of these artists, run a more profitable business, and give us what we want. I don't think that would kill human creativity. I think it will push musicians to try to invent something that is not there right now and that algorithms cannot do because it's not based on past data. And same happened, with Andy Warhol in pop art, with the invention of photography and digital photography. So I think we need to have faith in human ingenuity. But right now, what's impressive is that we have created something that can really synthesize, reproduce, and copy all the stuff that is predictable. And a lot of this stuff should be copied because it is predictable and it doesn't require human creativity. I mean, elevator music has existed for a while before AI. And if you have a little bit of a taste in music or not, you won't buy that music or consume it. Same for microwave, meals, etc. So I think doing something at scales and gaining in efficiencies doesn't corrupt or destroy the ability to do things better and to actually deploy our talents to do something creative.
Yeah, you're bang on. This is a point around going back to creativity for a second, because the human aspects of the human advantage, the human X factor, let's call it that for a second. And I'll go to music because we're talking about music. And, in my instrument, I play the Indian drums, the tablas. Like you play the piano, and they're, funnily enough, both called percussion instruments because we play them like this, which is, again, quite interesting. Now, in the tabla, there are many tabla players, like there are many piano players. There are some tabla players who are incredible, and there's some piano players who are incredible, but not all, right? There's some tabla players who, when you play, you're like, technically, you're flawless. Technically, you're flawless. Like, I can't say anything to you. But there's something missing. I don't know what it is. Now, that observation, that sensory skill is what makes us human. Now, you as a musician will know this, right? That's something that I can't explain it, but there's something when a talent spotter finds someone and says, you're going to be a hero. You're just going to be a hero. Oh, you're going to be the best musician ever. There is a unscientific, intuitive, sensory awakening that happens in that moment where someone has spotted something and says, I just love it. That magic is not created by AI, cannot be created by AI. Call it sensory, call it EQ, call it whatever, and so on. And so for that reason, for those listening to this, if you're concerned that you're going to be disrupted or disabled or lose a job and be useless and be sitting in some corner somewhere, trying to figure out life. That's not going to happen, because what I think we need to do is there's a huge enlightenment opportunity, a huge sort of renaissance, a revival of a renaissance, I think, of renaissance of humanity, because this moment is now going to give us, I hope, an opportunity to figure out what's so special about us. And damn, we keep reading about ancient civilization and what they got it, right? And, yoga, inner consciousness, meditation. If you've ever meditated, as you'll know, it takes you into a whole different realm. We know that. We know healing abilities. We know telepathy is true. Heck, we even know animals or other species. They did a test recently with birds, with a blue tit, the bird. I don't know if you know about this, where in different parts of the world, the blue tit was trying to get into some food, and they wrapped the food in these different parts of the world with cling film. Okay, and in a matter of 1 minute, one of the countries somewhere, some blue tit figured it out that if you just keep at it, your beak will get through the cling film and you'll get to the food. In under 1 minute, that message was transmitted in some sort of a quantum realm, of a form of communication, to all of the other blue tits in different parts of the world. They were tracking them simultaneously. So this special skill we have, the X factor we have as human beings, is ours. I don't think we all know it. We haven't discovered it, but there is an enlightenment coming, I believe. And so I feel confident about it. Now, when you look at your work, the AI work, I'm sure your next book is about to come out. Oh, by the way, one question I had. You wrote the book, a few months ago, okay? Since you've written the book, you've done podcasts, you've met more people. What would you have included in that book that you couldn't right now? If I was to say you have this one moment where you can alter the book and re-release it and no one cares, no money, bang, what would you change?
It's a really good question. Probably I would have gone a little bit heavier on the kind of workforce or labor market implications, given that this, a lot of what I was talking about was more a theoretical possibility, and now it is here. And that's basically something that concerns everybody. And I think, the other one is what you just maybe inadvertently alluded to, which is the importance of capturing or valuing the imperfection of humanity. And and I would say the magic of novelty and unpredictability, and then even serendipity, although I do have a section on engineering serendipity and rediscovering analog pleasures as that, because I think you talked about meditation, etc. I mean, for sure, AI is not sentient, nor will it ever be. This is literally the technical term that I love, other than mansplaining as a service, of course, is a stochastic parrot, because all it does is it groups words together based on the probability with which they have appeared, or the frequency with which they appear before. And it's as conscious or aware of what it's doing as a parrot, basically, right? But I do think that capitalism is funny because it's mostly fueled by creativity. Entrepreneurship is the main example, right? And innovation as creative destruction is that process. It gives us progress and it gives us evolution, etc., at the cultural level. But it's also a big enemy of creativity, because as soon as something works, we try to standardize it and productize it at scale, to the point that we want to squeeze out any rebel activity or unpredictability of humans, because they're managed. So I think, the fact that now AI is going to be this huge tool in the interest of driving productivity efficiencies for capitalism will create a bigger need for us to kind of rebel behaviorally and value these things. So I listened to a really interesting interview. I think it was the Adam Buxton podcast, and Tom Hanks was there. And one of the questions was, what do you think about the prospect of AI and basically deep fakes being you in many movies made in the future? And somebody asked me recently, last question. Somebody's watching this conversation. It was a podcast like this one. Somebody's watching this conversation in 10 years' time. How will they know that we were humans or we are? And I said, they won't. Maybe AI will. And you could argue, do we know if we are or not? I mean, we think we are, but I think Tom Hanks gave a fantastic answer, which is, I hope this happens. And my legal team is looking at this because I will die. I can only do, 10 more movies or 15 in my life. And actually, if there are 100 movies where AI plays me, and hopefully it'll be a younger and better looking version of myself, that
Yeah.
will probably increase the value of the movies that I have actually done myself. It's a little bit like, every fake Louis Vuitton bag that sells increases the value of the real one, which, by the way, is probably made of the same ingredients and materials,
Yeah.
but has a symbolic value that it has, elevating people's self-confidence and status when they pay 100 times more for it,
Yes.
So I think, we will value things because they are human made. And maybe it's the imperfection, the unpredictability, the serendipity that will actually make them more interesting and more real. When you go to a restaurant and people seem so robotic on script when they say, hey, how are you today? It happens more in America than the UK, but increasingly with any chain, you're like, oh my God, I wish I could interact with this human, not with the human trying to be a robot.
Correct. Yeah. Beautifully
I think
said.
that's
Yeah.
something, like emotional labor is like the script that we're giving people. And the same goes for any process that we inject in workplaces, etc. And then we pay lip service to creativity saying, oh, innovate, be different, don't fit in, etc. Well, let's hope that we actually mean that and that we value people for being themselves or actually bringing, their personality to these different interactions, which means worshipping and accepting or tolerating their imperfections.
Yeah. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That's a beautiful example of the of the waitress or waiter at a restaurant in the States. I mean, I'm in London, so I have the compare and contrast. You're bang on. I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll move to my thought experiment. I could talk to you for hours, and we're going to do that offline in physical form, in human form, when you come to London. My treat. So, but here's the question which is plaguing me, which is about the implications of this generative AI and deepfakes. Let's stay with deepfakes because that Tom Hanks example is great. On social trust, on eroding social trust, because let's take the West, and then I'm going to take you into the East for a moment. In the West, we are a high trust economy, high trust society. You say you're going to turn up, you're going to turn up. You say you're going to sign the contract, you're going to sign the contract. There are barriers, and the barriers in the tube or the train are there for a reason. You swipe your card and it opens up and you get to the next section and it's not manned. You could easily jump over in a low trust society, but you don't. You pay for it, and that's high trust. And the West, by large, is high trust. I think it's fair to say. When deepfakes kick in, you don't know whether to trust anyone. When Gen AI becomes so prevalent, where every essay, every book, every blog, every tweet, every LinkedIn post is actually not me. It's just my AI, my co-pilot that's like better than me doing it. There are implications to that would be catastrophic for our society that we've, by the way, now become so dependent with, God knows over how many years. So tell me a little bit about this concept of social trust in your mind, and then we'll move to the East, and then we'll come to the thought experiment.
Look, I think all those things are true. And first of all, you can regulate or create, processes to actually enforce the trust or protect the trust that people have, right? So, I mean, LinkedIn doesn't eliminate the possibility that you lie, but it actually makes it harder because there are a lot of people who are checking, and if you're lying in public, and the same goes if cryptography or blockchain don't eliminate the possibility. So I think it's always a bit of a cat and mouse game or race, and we can regulate for it. I think ultimately we will feel safer trusting in the analog world and in in-person interactions, which is very interesting, right? Because ultimately, that always has a cost that makes it unscalable and unaffordable for it. So, like in romantic matchmaking, everybody has access to Match.com or Tinder. But if you can afford a physical matchmaker, you sit down with them. Same in executive search, same in real estate, etc. So I think it's important to understand that a lot of the mechanisms that protect us from that and that actually fall on the people that have social proof and that are trusted experts are not so scalable, which creates an interesting kind of a conundrum for inequality if we want to reduce that. But yeah, I think it's a challenge that will be a technology challenge, but it also will fundamentally be fueled or driven by ethics. And I think ultimately, if the goal is to maintain trust, because without trust we cannot function as a society, then we should believe that we can put in place the necessary measures to protect it.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I think the jury's out on this because ethics, again, is all over the place right now. I think we're all trying in our silos to do something with ethics and regulation, but there's still work in progress, let's put it that way. Okay, so I'm going to move to, just the interest of time, I'm going to move to this thought experiment. It's quite a serious one, and it's an important one because it relates to a study, the recent study by World Health Organization on mental well-being. And it's quite a disturbing report. If you haven't seen it, you must take a look at it. And just a couple of statistics, one that relates to this generation and the next generation and the generations to come, which starts with this stat where 1 in 3 teenage girls are clinically depressed today. And they expect that figure is going to rise. Okay, it's not staying stable, it's going to rise. 1 in 6 adults are clinically depressed, and loneliness is a pandemic now. They genuinely believe loneliness is a pandemic. And this is very worrying. And there are many factors driving this. And one of the concerns I always have is social media, which, as much as I am dependent on, for me, it's just LinkedIn, everything else is sort of turned off for me. For the next few generations, the stories you hear from the ground around, you talked about dating just a moment ago. My God, I was just having a dialogue with some friends who are in their early 30s. I'm married, I've been married for years. I'm in my mid 40s, your childhood sweetheart story. For them, however, it's a doom and gloom story. And I've learned so much about ghosting, breadcrumbs, all of these things that happen on these dating apps. That is, for me, it's the cancer of social relationships. It's disabling what makes us human, and self-respect and respect for others and dignity is being torn apart in these, because of the fact that you hide behind your avatar is your social media, and you hide behind that app, and everything happens on the app. And even when physical interactions happen, you forget that human behavior is the beauty is human behavior, but actually the virtual avatar is taking over your human self, and therefore distorting your behaviors. You're behaving like in an odd way, where you're doing things that you and I would never do to one another. We'd respectfully say, "You first. Oh, open the door, please. You go ahead. No, have a glass first. Let me pour the glass of water for you." These small little etiquettes that make us human. And so I want to just finally throw the ball in your court for a second and get your observations on this issue of mental health and the pandemic the World Health Organization is so terribly concerned about and terrified about.
Look, so and I write about some of these studies in my chapter on digital narcissism in iHuman, as you know. So the data are very worrying and concerning. I don't think we can yet, or to this date or at this point, track visible changes at the level of the brain, but there are some studies that are already showing, dysfunctions that correlate with higher degrees or frequencies of exposure. And of course, it's a little bit like things really snowball. I mean, the more lonely you are to begin with, the more likely you are to gravitate towards these technological platforms, which in turn increase your loneliness and increase the probability that you are anxious, depressed, narcissistic, and so on. So look, all I will say is that we have to regulate and we have to protect consumers. You know, the analogy that this might be equivalent to in the days of big tobacco, that it's taken us 30 years to start warning people about the potential consequences and harms of smoking. You know, you can still smoke today. It's harder and it costs you more money, but you know, at least people are warned and they know it, and it has saved a lot of lives. I think we can probably save a lot of people from experiencing this awful psychological disorders or dysfunctions if we educate, if we warn, and if we regulate. And then, of course, you know, social media isn't the root cause of the problem, but it is in most instances like throwing gasoline to the fire, because there are issues that are endemic to the problems that societies have, which is why in certain societies these things are more problematic than in others. But actually, you know, we cannot change culture or society. What you can protect people against is tools that make things worse. So I'm extremely in favor of having as much research as possible, but also having regulations protect consumers, especially young people, teenagers, children, who, by the way, are simultaneously being told by their parents that they should not be on their smartphones or iPads, while the parents are all day on these devices, you know, and people learn by imitation. So I think even adults need not just some good hygiene and advice, but regulation.
Yeah, that's beautifully put and nicely summed up. Even adults need hygiene and regulation. You're right. We are the role models, and we are, you know, we have to lead from the front. So it's been amazing talking to you, Tomas, and there's so much more we have to talk about. We're limited by the fact that you've got to go somewhere and I've got to wrap up for the day. It's a Friday here, and you as well. And I've got my kids downstairs. I can hear them in the back garden.
Yeah.
But I have to tell you that
I can't. But listen, it's been a great pleasure, and also, you know, this is basically part one, and I look forward to the second, third, and especially the ones that consist in analog experiences and encounters.
Yeah, for sure. And before that, we're going to have our own analog experience when you come to London, where I'll meet you physically.
Exactly.
And we'll have this dialogue.
Exactly.
You've been an amazing guest. Thank you for the feedback. Thank you for coming on the show. I hope it's been a value and a good use of your time. We've certainly benefited. I will get you back on the show before your next book, or in time for your next book, where you can give us an indication of what you're going to write. And I look forward to being in touch. Thank you to my Straight Talkers and everyone who watches the show. Do click on subscribe at the bottom left or the right, wherever it may be. And I look forward to seeing you on the next Straight Talk. This is me signing off, Af Malhotra and Dr. Tomas Chamorro Premuzic. Thank you very much. Be well, be happy. Have a great weekend.
Thank you so much.